Good morning, afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm George Moss, host of the program here at allpointstv.com. The program called What's Going On Flex Number One Podcast Studio. We'll be doing two segments today, one for the Comcast viewers, and we'll be doing that taping for the first 27 minutes, and we'll stop there for a few seconds, and then we'll continue with the rest of the broadcast that goes on for the rest of the hour. I'm very glad to have all of you out there, and we're going to be talking about two topics today. The first topic is, of course, what happened in Orlando, Florida this past weekend. And then I'll try to finish up what I started last week here at the studio in terms of talking about Muhammad Ali and the death of a legend in terms of the loss to the world of the greatest boxer the world has ever seen. And we will discuss that during the second part of this broadcast today. I wanted to talk about that the whole hour that we will be here today at the studio, but this event that occurred in Florida changed our programmatic intent here at the studio. I want to talk about that first, and then we will, whatever time we have left over, then we will talk about the other matter as well. Both of them are important. I think what we want to add to what we're hearing, the studio is kind of designed to do some things outside of the norm. We know what the mainstream is doing, but we're not the mainstream. We're kind of like a sidebar to that conversation. So we try to add some things that are different. Otherwise, all we're doing is mimicking and being a mouthpiece for that which goes on very well, and they do a good job of it. I'm not criticizing the job they do. But if all we're doing is duplicating what they do, then there's really no purpose in what we do here. So we're going to try to bring some different information to that. I want you to also, while I'm thinking about it, to read my post on Facebook, because this program that we do here, which comes on at 2 o'clock, from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock live, and you can pick us up also on the internet at your leisure. We try to interface the broadcast we do here at the studio with what we do on Facebook, and you'll find a lot of the commonalities between what we are talking about and what we're writing about in terms of the two genres. And so you'll see a larger version of this in my written posts, which I just posted before I came to the studio today. What I'm going to be talking about as far as what occurred in Orlando will be something that has to do with the misdirection, I think, that is taking place. We had, as you know, I think the found count is somewhere around 50, more than 50 persons that were killed at a club in Orlando, and more than 50 others that were in fact injured. So we're talking about 100 persons that were injured this past Sunday. And at this point, there's a count. I'm sure some of the others that are wounded, whatever manner of severity, others will be joining that, unfortunately, and we'll have additional persons that will have died from this horrid event. What most persons are saying about it is simply that the person was the wife, the former wife of the shooter, Mateen, I think his name is saying that he was crazed and that he had been abusive and things of that sort. And then others are trying to look at it from the standpoint of what were, if anyone, that actually inspired this person to go off like this. I'm not going to be talking about that as much as I'm going to be talking about why these persons are in this, why we have this problem. Why we had the problem, for example, on 911, and what was said in the aftermath of 911, where there were approximately 3,000 Americans that were in fact killed, and the dialogue that occurred in the aftermath of this largest tragedy that we had in the history of the country on American soil from a foreign source, so to speak. Although the person were internal to the country, they didn't fly in from outside and do what they did on 911. But the agency through which it occurred was foreign. and those 3,000 Americans that died, it was interesting that after that had occurred, the conversation was a misdirectional kind of conversation that was taking place. And we were told that the person that did it were motivated from a source that was in fact peaceful. And that could not have been the case, because if there was a peaceful motivation, you could not have had the deaths. I mean, there was a contradiction to even, state that. So we have to raise the question about why that went on. And I really just figured this out myself in terms of what I finally had to understand that was going on, particularly in the aftermath of what happened yesterday, Sunday, in Orlando, where we had 100 persons plus that were injured in another incident. And I had to think about what that meant as far as why the dialogue was what I would call misdirectional, because we have to put the onus on the issue, and the issue is that we are not safe in this country. And that is also the case, by the way, in terms of other Western countries as well. We can add to that particular mix England, France, Germany, where I was this past summer of 2015. I was in the airport that was bombed in Belgium. I was in that airport on my way to another part of Europe. In that airport that was bombed in Brussels. I know the airport very well, having gone through there a number of times, probably about, 7 times I've gone through there. And I'm not on my way to Belgium, I'm going through there to some other destinations. But I've been in that airport a number of times, I know it very well. And I've had layovers where I've had to go, where I've gone through it and so on and so forth. So that is incident that occurred there. And you can name others, the Netherlands, you could name that, where you have a similar thing taking place and the jihadists that are there. And these places are not safe. England is not safe. France is not safe, where you have Hollande, Francois Hollande as the president, where you have Angela Merkel in Germany. It's not safe. And the United States is not safe. And what I had to think about is, when these incidents occur that show that we're not safe, why is the dialogue so different from pointing out the source of the unsafety? And it took me a while to get through the maze. And the maze would be where I was looking at the trees and not seeing the forest. I guess what I'm saying there was that I did not see that the blinders was kind of like a geometric blinder, the geometric aspect, which is the whole is equal to some of its parts. The implication being that you can't understand the whole if some of the parts are in fact missing. And that was what was really the problem in terms of me trying to put something together that would explain why it is that we're looking at something and we're told that we're looking at something else. I'll read some of what I'm talking about in just a minute in terms of some of the articles that came out, because a lot of these articles are misdirectional as well. And when I read the headline, you'll see what I mean by that, because the headlines are to be the headlines misinformed. And I think the intentions are quite clear. Now, when this incident occurred in Orlando, the pundits began not to talk about the possible reasons why that occurred, which I think the reason is fairly clear in terms of these constant en masse type of shootings where there is a single shooter and multiple persons being killed. I think that the intent should be clear and has to be pointed out, because I don't think it takes a rocket science to figure out what's going on here. On 911, one person said it. It wasn't mainstream, but it certainly was mainstream by Bush, who went to the nearest mosque and said that Islam is a peaceful religion. I think he was saying that for his own emphasis more than anything else. But to be honest with you, there are peaceful practitioners of Islam. There's no question about that. But the real truth is that Islam is not a peaceful religion; it is a religion of war. They are peaceful practitioners of it. And really, all religions are religions of war, but you have to see it in practice. And today, Christianity is a peaceful religion, but it has not always been the case. The question is, what do the proponents of it practice? And when you had the Crusades, where the two religions went to war against each other, in 1098, for example, when the first crusade was in fact fought, what you had there was both of these religions being combative and confronting each other. And you hear it in the Christian song, "On with Christian soldiers, on to war," and so on, because that was the landscape. The wars were defending each other against foreign encroachment, which is an ideological encroachment. But that would be different today, given the 18th century Enlightenment that Christianity that was undergone in Christianity in the 1800s, and that is a change in the landscape in that design, not so much in the other design. And to which is to say then that the Crusades that were discontinued on the one end were not discontinued on the other end. It certainly was paused at certain points, but it was not discontinued. It was paused, but not discontinued in terms of the forward looking of the continuation of it. You pause when it is to the advantage to pause. We have a history of that in this country as well, in terms of this movement further west, and where it was paused, and then after it was paused and reinforcement occurred, then it picked up again, and the result is what you see right now in terms of the country and how large it is and so on at this point. So it's not something that's unusual.
I was going to interject here, sorry, but it's like, Christians have been, we grew up with the idea that we knew that Christianity, in the name of Christianity, a lot of horrific things are done. Mm-hmm. And you could just simply read the teachings of the person who the religion is supposed to be centered upon, and he certainly didn't indicate to do that any time, during his time here on earth. And we have to shamefacedly admit that there's a lot of horrors that we should never have been committed. Mm-hmm. But that candor, that ability to dissect this stuff and actually have this kind of a intellectual disconnect where you can, the intellectual engagement to say it was wrong and to move on. I don't see that coming from the Muslims. Mm-hmm. Okay.
They haven't had an Enlightenment period, and I don't think we understand as much as we should about the Enlightenment period that we have had in the West. The West has gone through a period of enlightenment through which it became the citadel, quite frankly, of freedom. And that really is what is attracting the rest of the world to the West, because it has certain standards that you have in the West that are not found in other parts of the world, with some exceptions, but basically is a westernized type of a thing where you have these liberties and freedoms, and that has attracted people from all over the world. And you see the migration patterns that indicate that. Very few of these migration patterns are in the other direction. It seems like when you look at it, when you look at the migration patterns, the migration patterns are from the so-called third world into the Western countries. I know. So we know what attracts the rest of the world to those countries.
No, knowing you as being much of a fan of, as I am, as Ayn Rand, mm-hmm. I think you could certainly say that there is definitely a valuation of the individualistic rights mm-hmm. enshrined in the West.
Yes.
You don't see that in the East. If you just look at the modes, even if you want to just detach yourself from the belief or whatever, if you just look at the modes of ideology or the kind of the current themes and the themes within a religion, mm-hmm. the East, actually the East, especially in Buddhism, they want you to dissolve your consciousness into become oneness of the universe. Mm-hmm. Whereas Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, or Judaism, Christianity actually mostly, you want to keep your soul pure, or you want to move it and cleanse of transgressions and sense because you're held accountable as an individual, even in the afterworld. Whereas if you look at the what was in the East, you just want to be dissolved into nothingness. That's the aim.
Yeah,
and that's and that's kind of abhorrent, in my opinion.
It is
to what
an
we
important point. What you're describing there is the utopian vision, which is a socialist vision, where it is that all people will share equally on the same level, and none will be doing better than others. And that vision, by the way, is one that we're seeing being transplanted into this country through things like Common Core and things like that, where you are making everything and everybody the same. And there are real problems with it because the way it works in school, for example, is that you see people that are in the schools that are held to the same study at the same time throughout the country in those states that have Common Core. And it's the idea that you have to keep everybody on the same level. And of course, we have some that are more advanced than some of the others. What it does, it frustrates them because their rate of speed is held down to a lower standard than it would be held down if they were all in fact treated as individuals able to rise to their own level. They all held they're studying the same thing every day. So that's a different kind of practice here, and we have to look at it and see we have to really look at that and see if that's what we want to do in this country. But that's certainly something that's antithetical to what the Western standards have been in the past, and now those standards are being suborned by other practices. That could become a problem, and I think it is a problem at this point right now. In the my blind spot, and let me make this point here about why I did not figure out until I began to think about this latest event and why that was being explained to me again by the press and by political leaders as if this had nothing to do with a larger issue that we have to come together and confront and own up to, because we do have a problem here. And I had to kind of get away from some of the things that I had been tutored into that made me draw the wrong conclusion. One book, for example, was a book that had been written by Griffin called The Creature of Jekyll Island. And what Griffin does in that book is give a more or less conspiratorial understanding of what it is we're looking at. And I took that for a while as gospel, that this is a conspiracy that is the motivation for people telling us more or less to look away from what is really going on and see it through their lens rather than through the lens that we're looking at it for ourselves. In other words, our lying eyes were not to be believed, but to be dismissed, and we see it through the lens of the media and other politicals who want us to see it a certain way. And it looks like conspiracy is motivating it, and I thought that for a long time, but it's not conspiracy. The people are not smart enough to do a conspiracy on the magnitude of that is on, and that's a point by which Ayn Rand makes in a book called The New Intellectuals is her book, one of her books, and she puts a damper on the idea that conspiracy explains it. She talks about these cafeteria style conspiracies, and she says correctly, as I see it now, that the situation is too vast for a conspiracy to explain it. So I had a blinder here, but as I thought about it through what happened yesterday in Orlando, I began to understand what my mistake was. My mistake was that I was looking at the effect as the intent. You see, if you say, for example, that we're looking at a form of treason, let's say that you put it in that genre, that it's kind of like a bit of treason to let people come in who are posing a threat to the country once they get here. I mean, you see it in Europe, for example. And you have a tendency to think of it in terms of, well, why would they be doing that? And then you look at it as conspiratorial because the effect of it is that people are in the country creating havoc in those countries. But the problem that I was having with that is I did not understand that I was looking at the effects. And I was drawing the conclusion of it, looking at it more or less through the lens of Griffin's book and others of that sort. who have thought about this, but I think drew the wrong conclusions about it. And it looks like the intent is conspiracy. What I had done incorrectly was that I looked at the effects of it and put the effects as the intent. The effects is where what you would call treason would be found, in a sense of how it plays out. But it's not intended to be treason. There's something else going on here. And what's going on here is that the intent is globalism. And to put a damper on the immigration you see in Europe is to put a damper on the intent, which is the global expansion comes out of not conspiracy, but a power addiction. The intent is the expansion of power. And because of that, and because there is an intent, you have to then allow certain things to go on, and the effect of those things allowed to go on, such as persons coming in and things like that, they may not be the ones that come in with the values of those countries in which they are in fact joining on to. And none of these persons coming in there from the third world have Western values, because those values are not taught in those countries where they come from. So it looks like they're letting them in for treasonous purposes. They do not intend to undermine their own country. That is the effect of what they're doing. That's not the intent of what they're doing. And I had to understand that. And I now have come to the conclusion, as I wrote in my article before coming to the studio, that the intent is to conceal the global intent. And let me say this about Donald Trump. The reason Donald Trump is being opposed is not because Donald Trump doesn't like women. I mean, let's face it, the man has married three women, hasn't married any men as of yet. But he's been married 2 times, married now a 3rd time. So to say that he doesn't like women, then what does that mean? I mean, you have to like somebody. So does he like men? And if he does, why is he marrying women if he hates women? That narrative doesn't work. And yet that's what's put out there. But let me just say this about the narrative. The people that make that narrative don't care whether he likes women or not. They don't care about that. And those who are saying that he is racist, and he's not racist, because that's also another provable misdirectional point. In fact, in this country, as quiet as it's kept, you have more people that are pedophiles in this country than you have racists in this country. And if that's not true, then we can deal with racial issues in this country without making it up, because you can just point to those racial situations that exist and say that's the example of it, and this is the example of it. But if you're pointing to situations that are not racist, and you're making it up out of whole cloth as one aspect to it, then the person that are doing the pointing are the ones who are racist. It's certainly not racist, for example, for a police officer to defend the right to his gun when that gun is being, when someone's trying to take that gun from the officer, as happened in Michael Brown's case in Ferguson, Missouri. That's certainly not racism for the officer to defend his right to legally carry a weapon as a part of the defense that the community has against those who are lawbreakers. And to say then that the person was not armed does not mean that the person did not have any arms. The person had 2 arms. And so this idea they're not armed, just a media putting together something that would make it appear that this was excessive in terms of what really occurred there. But yet we've had two investigations of it, and either one came up with a finding of fault on the part of the police officer who was fired for doing his job. But, the media can kind of fan it in such a way as that it does not appear that was the case. But we've had 2 investigations, and both investigations, one which was a local investigation and one that was a federal investigation, both of them came to the same conclusion, and no charges were in fact filed against the officer, and the officer is now free, although he doesn't have his job. But the finding of fact did not meet with the standard operating procedure is that racism explains it. If racism explains as much as they say it does in the society, you wouldn't have to make these cases up, and you would not have to reach back into the past and bring the past up to the present, such as the slave movies that Snoop Dogg is talking about. You wouldn't have to reach back into the past and bring those forward if the present situation was as porous with racism as they say it is. I think we have to close down now for the Comcast viewers. Hope you will join the rest of the dialogue on the network. You can find us here at allpointstv.com, and we'll have the rest of it that's found there. Glad you stayed with us, and hope you'll be with us next time we in fact air a part of the program. Okay, we're going to continue with what we're saying here at the studio in terms of the rest of the program. What I came up with is that what my confusion was is that I got intent confused with the effect. And I now see where I made the mistake that I made in terms of analyzing what was going on, because I put the consequence of the intent in front of the intent, and I took that as the explanation of why this was taking place, and did not understand that it was a classic case of me putting the proverbial cart before the horse, and not understanding that the intent was not to suborn the integrity of the country. That's not the intent. The intent we see here through things like global warming and things like that is expand power, because power is an addiction, and the more power you get, the more power you want to assume, and that expansion is, first of all, statewide, then it's national, then is supranational, which is to say is international, and just continues to grow geometrically in terms of person wanting more and more and more to engorge upon, because power is, as I said, it is just as addictive, quite frankly, as a narcotic is. It's another kind of narcotic, a psychological narcotic, and you see it operating in all people that wield power. I would go so far as to say this, as a matter of fact, that all people that are career politicians have this addiction, and there are no exceptions to it. If you say, for example, that Kim Jong-un, who is the strong man, the dictator, if you want to call him that, I would call him a despot, I would call him a dictator, a totalitarian, as can be seen by the fact that his guns keep him in power, and he does not intend to leave power. So what feeds his addiction is the guns that buy the silence of the people in North Korea, and that's how he's able to maintain power on a career basis. We will all agree he's a career politician, although we see him in more dictatorial terms as we see career politicians in this country. The question then becomes, what then feeds the politician's addiction here? Well, not so much guns here. What feeds the addiction here is the propaganda through which the guns are not necessarily have to be visible, although they are there. As can be seen by the fact that in Orlando, where you had this situation that occurred, you saw that the guns took this person down. The problem is, and what we didn't see and what we didn't pay attention to, is that they were not the guns of the 300 persons in that club, but the guns of the state. I mean, in other words, what you saw in Orlando is that those guns are present, but they're not as visible as they are in North Korea. But they're there. What is more visible is that you see the propaganda as the thing that keeps the addiction in place and feeds the addiction, because people go to the polls and feed it. But if they understood what they're feeding, then that would not be the case. And you can either have, everybody talks about it, dealing with it this way in terms of term limits, or you could deal with it by understanding what it is that is the problem, which is the addiction, and deal with it through the voting process, and simply end it because you have the power to do so by making sure that addiction does not stand because you don't feed it through the voting process. I'll come back to Donald Trump now. Donald Trump is not a threat because he's a racist. They don't care anything about that, and they don't believe he's a racist. They don't believe that. And they don't believe that he's a sexist either. Or homophobic, which that endorsement he got yesterday, I understand. Somebody called and told me they got an endorsement from the whatever that alphabet soup is, explains the lesbians and the gay community, that he had an endorsement out of Phoenix yesterday, Donald Trump did. And if that is true, and I got it from a reliable source, so I would take it upon the word of this particular person, because normally when they call me about some information that I may have not come across, they pretty much have it nailed down, so I would take him at his word in this case as well. So if that is true, then that puts a nail in that operation, nail that board down, because if he is endorsed by those who are members of the lesbian and gay community, then that's a problem for those that are trying to promote the idea that their opposition to Donald Trump is because he is homophobic or he is sexist or he's racist, because if any of those things were true, you would not see what is going on. I mean, for example, with blacks. It's now known, according to the latest polls, is that Donald Trump, according to the polls, will get 27% of the black vote. And we have not had those kinds of numbers in terms of a Republican getting those kinds of votes since 1960, when Richard Nixon got those votes, because blacks were just beginning to make their seismic demographic shift from the Republican Party
besides
to the Democratic Party.
If you look at domestic problems and stuff like that in situations and his way of doing stuff, Nixon actually was a liberal. Underneath his watch, they increased the, like a welfare at ADC, AFDC, whatever it was. that was actually, pushed during, because it was a continuation of the war on poverty thing.
Yes.
And so he also
affirmative action also started in 1971 under Nixon.
The very term affirmative action.
The term, you're right,
Yeah.
the term.
Yeah.
The actual institutionalization of it.
Right. So in many ways, people want to beat up on Nixon as being this, as some people do. Some liberals I've heard, they're just really in error, because he really wasn't. He was also a Quaker, and the Quakers also had a history of being for equal rights and stuff like that way before it was fashionable. Many of them were at the centerpiece of trying to get destroy slavery in the country. So I mean that Nixon was not this big boogeyman. I mean, let's keep in perspective. I believe he ordered the break-in at the Watergate hotel, Watergate, to check on the Democrats.
Yeah, I'll argue about that.
But I do believe that. I don't put that past him. It fits his personality type. But that's and if you look at back that and all the other stuff the other presidents have done since then, it was nothing comparison to what they have gotten away with.
We're gonna have an on-air discussion sometime in the future about that. Johnny and I are gonna argue about that on the air. We've had a lot of discussions off air about that, and we'll have to have an on-air discussion about it as well. It'll be very interesting to hear both sides, be point counterpoint. We disagree on that point. I don't think Nixon ordered creep, or nor did he have to. I think it was fanatical kind of a thing in terms of they wanted to make sure he was going to be elected, but he was not in the trouble in being reelected in '72 because of the opposition. And you see how it turned out. But anyway, we'll discuss that one day on the air. I want to say this: when I talk about liberals and conservatives, I'm not talking about it in the same way in which they discuss it. With the liberals being neatly packaged on one side, and you have all the ones in the Republican Party, and they on that one side, and then all the liberals, they on this other side over here, and they all in the Democratic Party. I do not take that fine combing of the analysis of who's on one side of the political divide and who's on the other side of the political divide. It's just like, this idea I used to argue with people who were arguing about Malcolm X's view of the house Negro and the field Negro, and I said that Malcolm was drawing the line too fine around this idea that all the ones out here in the field, they feel a certain way, and all those who are working in the house in slavery, they feel a certain way, and he drew it too finely. There were house Negroes, meaning those who were more compliant. There were house Negroes in the field. They weren't all out there like Nat Turner and then Mark Vesey and Gabriel Prosser. There were some house Negroes out there too, as Malcolm would say, house Negroes, if it was all in the house and all the field Negroes in the field. It was not that. There were some field Negroes in the house too, and there were some house Negroes in the field, meaning there were militants in the field, and there were some that were militant in the house as well. They were in both places, and both groups were in both places. So when I talk about liberals and conservatives, and they get into this blue state and this red state stuff, then if they had blue states and red states, and that is always solidified in terms of all the ones over here are going to always vote that way, and all the ones over there are going to vote a certain way, then how do you explain Ronald Reagan in 1976? And how did you explain him in 1984 when he ran against Mondale? When Mondale ran against Reagan for re-election, he won one state, Minnesota. He had 10 electoral votes in Minnesota. He had 3 in the District of Columbia, which has never voted for a Republican ever since they've got the electoral votes. They were given 3 electoral votes in the 60s, and they never voted for Republicans. So you got 3 electoral votes in the District of Columbia, which is par for the course. You got 10 in Minnesota, and he lost every other state. But he didn't do that. But he didn't even win. Reagan didn't even win the nomination in 1976 when he stood up against Gerald Ford, who was made the incumbent after being appointed. John was saying Nixon. Nixon being, I say Nixon was overthrown by a media coup. They had a coup d'etat in this country. Woodward, there was Bob Woodward, and there was Carl Bernstein, the ones that wrote this book called All the President's Men, and put out this book called All the President's Men and made a movie about it. And what happened there was a coup d'etat in this country right in front of the American people that never saw it and don't see it now. We had an unelected government after Nixon was overthrown, and we had a president, Gerald Ford and Nelson Rockefeller, that was the vice president, and neither one of them was elected, and the American people didn't even see it. Gerald Ford was not elected president, and Nelson Rockefeller was not appointed vice president. It was a person in the presidential office and a person in the vice presidential office. Both of them installed there, and neither one voted into power. Can you tell me how that happened? I can tell you how it happened. I know what your analysis is. I know what John's analysis is. I have analysis also. And we're going to argue that one day on the air, because that was a coup d'etat, bloodless coup. That's not why they're against Donald Trump, by the way, because they feel this way. See, these ideas that persons have this philosophical, spirit in back of their domain, and they're in these camps. And all the ones over here, they feel this way. All the ones over there, they're in that way. That's like, what they say, but that's a political illusion. That's not true. There are some in both camps. And when I say liberal and conservative, when I say liberal, I'm talking about Mitt Romney. I'm talking about George Bush. I'm talking, and as well as talking about Obama. There are those in that political view in both groups. So why then are people like Bill Kristol, and let me name some of these others because you're looking at them right now, but let me try to point out some of the names so you'll know who I'm talking about. Glenn Beck, Mark Levine. I know you're going to tell me they're conservatives. You're going to tell me that it's snowing outside too, and there's sun outside the studio. You can say that. You can't prove it. And these other so-called conservatives, I said Bill Kristol, those 22 writers that wrote in the National Review that's put out by Rich Lowry. Rich Lowry and all these very vocal people. I mean, look at Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney would not go away. And does anybody really believe this guy is so upset, so disgusted with the views that Donald Trump has that got him out there, having run in 2012, and now saying that the Republican Party gave birth to Donald Trump? If he had won, that would have prevented Donald Trump. So what explains them being out there with all this opposition and them trying to sabotage? I mean, I read last week where the senator down in South Carolina, is talking about if Donald Trump remains as the standard bearer for the Republican Party, if they don't get him out of there at the convention that's going to be held next month, if they don't get him out of there, then he says he's going to go into the Democratic Party. Can I ask him a question? How do you have certain views with these camps being this dichotomy, right? Conservative and Democrat. How do you abandon those views when it's very clear that the Democratic Party doesn't carry conservative views? It carries socialist views. How does the senator, the good senator from South Carolina, say he's going to go and join the Democratic Party if he's upset with Donald Trump not being a conservative? How does he go and join a party that never represented itself as being conservative? That's not it. There's something else here. And I was saying earlier about the globalists. So what is really the problem here? The problem is that Donald Trump is a nationalist. And when he says that he wants to make America great, then he's talking about borders here. And you probably noticed that they're talking on the other side. And I'm not just talking about those in the Democratic Party who are not only talking but also allowing for porous borders to prevail where everybody can come across, and building a wall is antithetical to those persons, but it's antithetical to the people that are in the Republican Party also. And Donald Trump is talking about national barriers being put up, bringing jobs back to the country. You see, if you talk about immigration in borderless countries, you're talking about a utopian vision represented more visibly by people like Bernie. They call him Bernard Sanders, but if I say Bernard, it doesn't sound quite as familiar and family, oriented. Just like Jimmy sounds different than James, so Jimmy Carter, not James Carter, or FDR. FDR is a lot better than calling the name of the president, or JFK. You notice all these persons that are considered liberals have these initials in their name. You never have. What's the name for Ronald Reagan? If I said RWR, would anybody recognize that's Ronald Wilson Reagan? No, because nobody uses the initials for the conservative names. I mean, that's just like a little undercurrent here that you're not supposed to see. But to make you more familiar with the collectivists, right? The statists. But they're not all on one side. There are some of them on the other side. And Mitt Romney and those guys are a bit more conservative than Man in the Moon. They're globalists. And Donald Trump is a threat to the globalist agenda, because Donald Trump is talking about bringing jobs back here. You see, if you have a global agenda, the utopian vision is lift all boats. But what is not part of the publicly expressed agenda is that, it lifts all boats, but that's not the total story. The story is who, when those boats are lifted, control those boats. And that's where the globalists come in, because it's about the expansion of power and control of the addition of boats brought into the process and umbrella of the authority they will wield. It's an addiction we're talking about. And that is what explains what we are saying right now, and that's what they're against. If Donald Trump wins this election coming up, it's going to throw a monkey wrench into a whole lot of things, and they intend to stop him. I noticed that what we're hearing when they start saying things like Donald Trump, they still haven't given up on stopping him. They're saying that they need to go to the convention with the idea of persons not saying anything on the first ballot, because if they're committed to the first ballot, but if they're sat on the first ballot, then they can then disaffiliate on the second ballot based on the rules. But that's been in the rules, because the rules are that you have to, in fact, do the same thing that you were, in fact, pledged to do based upon the vote. Okay, well, I do want to talk about Muhammad Ali. I'll do that next week, because we're going to abbreviate the program, because the Catherines are here and we got to leave start this afternoon. I want to make sure we get out of here on time, because I like to start exactly at 3:30, and I like to be home when they're beginning to watch the program, when they begin to do the program, so I can watch it. So we'll do the other part of the discussion next week, and I'll finish up this as well in terms of tying this together in terms of a much larger context in which this is playing out, that I want you to see as viewers here of the program on allpointstv.com. Okay, until that time, I want you to follow your dream, because if you don't follow your dream, you'll never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.